"You missed a spot, old man." The laughter came first, sharp and effortless, echoing across the polished concrete floor of the SEAL training gym before the words had fully settled into the air. Daniel Brooks paused only long enough to let the mop glide to a stop beside his worn boots, his weathered hands resting lightly on the wooden handle. Around him, rows of squat racks gleamed beneath bright industrial lights, heavy plates clanged against steel, and the scent of rubber flooring mixed with fresh sweat and disinfectant. It was barely 6:30 in the morning, but the building already pulsed with the relentless rhythm of America's most demanding warriors preparing for another day. None of them looked twice at the elderly janitor except when they needed someone to joke about. One young operator flicked his damp training towel toward the freshly cleaned floor with casual precision, smiling as it landed exactly where Daniel had just finished mopping. Another nudged a water bottle with his boot, sending it rolling across the polished surface until it stopped beside the old man's bucket. "Guess you'll have to earn your paycheck," someone muttered, drawing another round of chuckles. Daniel simply bent over, picked up the towel, wrung it carefully into the bucket, and resumed pushing the mop with slow, measured strokes. He never hurried. He never complained. The silence surrounding him seemed almost unnatural inside a room built on competition and noise. To the young men filling the gym, he was little more than part of the building itself, as ordinary as the fluorescent lights overhead or the faded motivational banners hanging from the rafters. Nobody knew when he arrived each morning because he was always there before sunrise. Nobody knew where he went after sunset because he disappeared before anyone noticed him leaving. They knew only that the old janitor with silver hair and faded blue eyes cleaned their gym every day and spoke fewer words in a week than most operators used during warm-ups. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cole watched the exchange from across the room, arms folded across his chest, his expression carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Brooks," he called without looking away from the training lane. "Don't forget the mirrors today. Command inspection is tomorrow, and I don't want fingerprints anywhere." Daniel gave a quiet nod. "Yes, Chief." His voice was calm, roughened by age, yet strangely steady, as though nothing could hurry it. Ryan barely acknowledged the response. To him, Daniel was simply another civilian employee, another invisible face keeping the base running behind the scenes. Nearby, a pair of younger SEAL candidates whispered while watching the old man work. "Think he ever served?" one asked with a grin. The other shrugged. "Maybe in the cafeteria." They laughed, convinced the joke deserved it. Daniel reached the edge of the weight room and carefully lifted the yellow caution sign before moving it a few feet farther down the aisle. As he stretched his arm forward, the sleeve of his faded gray work shirt slipped back for only an instant before he quietly pulled it into place again. No one seemed to notice except one curious recruit whose eyes lingered for a fraction of a second, uncertain whether he had actually seen something beneath the fabric or simply imagined it. Then the music swelled. Another barbell crashed onto its rack, and the moment disappeared as completely as if it had never happened at all. The morning workout intensified as another class rotated onto the training floor, bringing fresh energy and louder voices into the sprawling gym. Heavy bags swung from reinforced beams while instructors barked time drills across the room. Daniel Brooks quietly emptied a trash bin overflowing with tape rolls and plastic water bottles before replacing the liner with practiced efficiency. Every movement seemed effortless, not because he rushed, but because he never wasted motion. He knew exactly where every cart belonged, which cleaning solution left no streaks on the mirrors, and which floor sections became dangerously slick after conditioning drills. Years of routine had turned ordinary work into something almost graceful. Yet no one noticed. To the operators passing within inches of him, he was simply part of the background. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cole continued supervising the morning evaluation, occasionally glancing toward Daniel only when another small task came to mind. "Brooks," he called again, pointing toward a line of benches. "Those need to be spotless before the commander tours the building this afternoon." Daniel nodded once. "They will be." His answer disappeared beneath the sound of medicine balls striking the floor. Nearby, Mason Reed leaned against a squat rack while wiping sweat from his forehead. "Does he ever smile?" he asked Tyler Grant. Tyler laughed. I am not sure he even knows where he is. Mason lowered his voice just enough to avoid being overheard. I bet he has been cleaning gyms longer than we have been alive. The two shared another grin before returning to their conversation, convinced the old janitor either had not heard them or simply did not matter. Daniel continued polishing the metal bench supports until they reflected the overhead lights without a single fingerprint. His eyes remained focused on the work in front of him, but his awareness extended far beyond the cloth in his hand. Without turning around, he stepped slightly to one side a moment before a trainee carrying 2 heavy kettlebells hurried behind him. The young man never realized he had nearly collided with the elderly janitor. Daniel simply continued wiping the bench as though nothing unusual had happened. An instructor watching from across the room frowned for a brief moment, sensing the timing had been strangely perfect, but the thought quickly disappeared beneath the demands of the training schedule. A few minutes later, one of the recruits struggled to secure a loose cable attachment on a resistance machine. He pulled at the pin several times before muttering in frustration. Daniel quietly walked over carrying his bucket. "May I?" he asked. The recruit shrugged impatiently and stepped aside. Daniel examined the mechanism for only a second before rotating the attachment slightly and sliding the locking pin smoothly into place. "Sometimes the weight shifts the alignment," he said softly. "Relieve the pressure first." The recruit tested the machine. It worked perfectly. Before he could say anything, Daniel had already returned to his mop. "Lucky guess," Mason whispered with a smirk. Tyler nodded. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." More laughter followed, but one older maintenance technician standing near the supply room watched Daniel with quiet curiosity. He had seen experienced mechanics solve equipment problems with that same calm confidence. There had been no hesitation, no trial and error, only immediate understanding. As Daniel reached for another cleaning cloth, the cuff of his faded work shirt caught briefly on the edge of the utility cart. The fabric slid back just enough to expose the edge of a weathered black tattoo wrapping around his left forearm before he gently freed the sleeve and covered it again. This time, Emily Foster, the civilian medical coordinator passing through the gym with a clipboard in her hands, slowed her pace ever so slightly. Her eyes lingered on the faded mark for barely a heartbeat before she continued walking, but something deep in her memory stirred with quiet unease, as though she had seen that forgotten symbol somewhere long before this ordinary morning ever began. By late morning, the gym had settled into the controlled chaos that always came before an official inspection. Every rack was occupied, every treadmill hummed, and every conversation carried the quiet edge of competition. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cole walked the floor with the confidence of a man determined to present perfection. His sharp eyes swept across every detail until they landed on Daniel Brooks polishing the glass doors leading into the recovery room. "Brooks," Ryan called, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Since you seem to have plenty of time, why do not you help us with something useful?" Several operators looked over with amused expressions. Daniel lowered the cleaning cloth and turned calmly toward the chief. "What do you need?" Ryan gestured toward a thick climbing rope hanging from the ceiling nearly 20 feet above the rubber floor. "One of the recruits says the knot up there is twisted. Think you can fix it?" Laughter rippled through the room before Daniel even answered. Tyler Grant folded his arms with a grin. "Come on, Chief. The man is over 80 years old." Mason Reed added, "Maybe bring him a ladder and a nap afterward." More laughter echoed between the steel beams overhead. Daniel studied the rope for a quiet moment before shaking his head politely. "I think one of your operators can handle it." Ryan smirked as though he had expected exactly that answer. "That is what I thought." His words were not loud, but they carried enough for everyone nearby to hear. Funny how some people spend years around warriors without learning what real work looks like. Daniel did not respond. He simply picked up his bucket and continued wiping fingerprints from the recovery room window. The silence seemed to irritate Ryan even more than an argument would have. Across the room, one of the younger trainees attempted to climb the rope anyway, but after several feet, the twisted section forced him back down. The small inconvenience became another source of joking conversation, quickly forgotten by everyone except Daniel, who quietly walked over after the group dispersed. He reached up, gently loosened the lower section, rotated the rope half a turn, and the entire twist relaxed naturally from top to bottom without requiring anyone to climb it. He never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. He simply returned the rope to its resting position and resumed mopping the nearby floor. Mason happened to glance over just in time to see the rope hanging perfectly straight. "Well," he muttered, "that was strange." Tyler shrugged. "Probably dumb luck." Neither of them realized that Emily Foster had witnessed the entire exchange from the hallway. It was not the rope that caught her attention. It was the movement of Daniel's left arm as he reached overhead. His shirt sleeve slid farther back than before, exposing nearly the entire faded tattoo circling his forearm. Time seemed to slow for a single heartbeat. Emily stopped walking. Her clipboard lowered slightly in her hands. The symbol was old, almost blurred by decades, yet its shape struck something buried deep within her memory. Years earlier, while helping her late father organize boxes of military photographs and retirement papers, she had seen a nearly identical mark in a faded picture that had no caption and no names written on the back. Her father, a retired Joint Special Operations Command officer, had quietly taken the photograph from her hands and said only one sentence before locking it away again. "If you ever see that symbol again, remember that history does not always wear a uniform." Standing outside the gym, Emily felt an unexpected chill despite the warm summer air flowing through the open entrance. Inside, Daniel had already pulled his sleeve back into place and continued polishing the spotless floor, completely unaware that someone had finally recognized the first thread of a story everyone else believed had been forgotten decades ago. Emily Foster did not continue toward the medical office. Instead, she stood just beyond the doorway of the gym, her heartbeat strangely uneven as fragments of an old conversation resurfaced with startling clarity. She could still picture her father's study, lined with weathered books and neatly arranged photographs from a lifetime of military service. Among them had been one faded image showing 5 young men standing beneath dense jungle trees, none of them smiling, each with a rolled sleeve exposing the same dark symbol she had just glimpsed on Daniel Brooks's forearm. She had been barely 16 when she asked what unit they belonged to. Her father had closed the album without answering directly. "Some stories are carried by people, not by records," he had said before quietly locking the photograph away. Until this morning, she had almost convinced herself she had imagined the entire conversation. Inside the gym, life continued as though nothing had happened. Barbells struck padded platforms with heavy thuds. Stopwatch alarms chirped between training intervals. Instructors corrected posture while recruits pushed through another demanding circuit. Daniel moved quietly between them with his cleaning cart, wiping handrails, collecting discarded towels, and replacing empty sanitizer bottles with the same patient rhythm that had defined his entire morning. Ryan Cole walked past him without slowing. "Make sure the conference hallway shines before 1300 hours, he said. "The commander notices everything." Daniel answered with his usual calm nod. "It will be ready." Ryan never looked back. To him, the conversation had already ended. Emily watched Daniel reach into the utility cart for another bottle of cleaner. As he lifted it, the loose fabric of his sleeve slipped back once more. This time the tattoo remained visible for several seconds. It was neither elaborate nor decorative. Time had softened the ink until only the essential lines remained clear, forming a weathered circular design surrounding a simple 5-pointed star. There were no names, no dates, no words claiming honor or achievement. It looked almost ordinary unless someone already knew what they were seeing. Emily took one careful step closer, trying not to attract attention. Before she could speak, Mason Reed wandered over carrying an empty sports drink bottle. "Hey, old man," he called casually. "You planning to get that thing removed someday?" Daniel looked up with quiet curiosity. "Which thing?" Mason pointed toward the fading ink. "That tattoo. Looks like something from an old motorcycle club." Tyler Grant laughed from behind him. "Or maybe he lost a bet 50 years ago." A few nearby operators smiled without much thought, treating the exchange as harmless amusement. Daniel lowered the spray bottle onto the cart and gently pulled his sleeve back into place. His expression never changed. "It reminds me of some good men," he said softly. Nothing more. No explanation followed. The simplicity of the answer seemed almost disappointing to the young operators, who quickly lost interest and returned to their conversation. But Emily remained frozen where she stood. The words were nearly identical to something her father had once whispered while staring at that forgotten photograph. Good men. Not famous men. Not heroes. Simply good men. A quiet weight settled over her thoughts. She slipped her phone from her pocket and opened the secure contact list she rarely used outside official medical coordination. Her thumb hovered over one familiar name, a retired Joint Special Operations Command operations officer who had served with her father for decades. She hesitated for only a moment before taking a discreet photograph of the now empty cleaning cart where Daniel had been standing seconds earlier, committing the faded symbol to memory instead. Then she quietly stepped into the hallway, knowing she needed an answer before Commander Ethan Ward arrived for the afternoon inspection, because for the first time that morning she no longer believed the elderly janitor was the least important person inside the building. Emily stepped into the quiet hallway outside the gym, closing the heavy glass door behind her until the pounding of barbells became little more than a distant rhythm. She unlocked her phone and selected a contact she had not called in almost 3 years. The line rang twice before a calm, older voice answered. "Thomas Hale." Emily lowered her voice instinctively. "Mr. Hale, this is Emily Foster, Richard Foster's daughter." A brief silence followed before the warmth in the man's voice returned. "Emily, it has been a long time. Is everything all right?" She glanced back through the narrow window in the gym door where Daniel Brooks slowly pushed his cleaning cart between rows of weight benches. "I need to ask you about a symbol my father once showed me. A faded tattoo. A circle around a 5-pointed star." The silence on the other end became noticeably longer. When Thomas finally spoke, his tone had changed completely. "Where did you see it?" Emily described the elderly janitor without adding her own conclusions. She mentioned the silver hair, the quiet manner, the gray work shirt, and the way he covered the mark almost automatically. Thomas interrupted only once. "Did he volunteer any explanation?" "Only 4 words," Emily answered. "He said it reminds him of some good men." Another pause settled over the call. She could hear papers shifting in the background before Thomas spoke again, almost to himself. "He still says that." Emily frowned. "You know who he is?" "I know who he might be," Thomas replied carefully. "Do not ask him questions. Do not mention the tattoo. And whatever you do, do not let anyone treat him differently until I verify something." Emily felt the quiet urgency behind every word. "What are you verifying?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "A story that officially ended decades ago." The call ended moments later with a promise to return within the hour. Emily remained standing in the hallway, staring through the glass as Daniel continued cleaning the gym floor exactly as before, completely unaware that a single forgotten symbol had reopened a chapter of military history few people even knew had existed. Inside the gym, Daniel carried a folded stack of fresh towels toward the recovery area. As he reached for the top shelf, his fingers brushed the edge of a weathered leather key holder attached to his belt. The familiar touch instantly carried him somewhere far away. For the briefest moment, the polished walls of the modern training facility disappeared. In their place came the thick scent of damp jungle earth after heavy rain, the distant hum of helicopter blades somewhere beyond the tree line, and the quiet breathing of 4 exhausted young men sitting beneath a canvas shelter as dawn filtered through the leaves. None of them wore medals. None of them expected recognition. One of them held a simple homemade needle while another mixed dark ink inside a dented metal cup. No speeches were given. No promises of glory were made. One by one they marked the same small symbol onto their left forearms, not as a badge of achievement but as a promise that if even one of them ever returned home, he would remember the others for the rest of his life. Daniel could still hear the calm voice of the oldest among them. "History forgets missions. Men must not forget each other." The memory faded as quietly as it had arrived. The jungle dissolved. The bright lights of the gym returned. Daniel blinked once, adjusted the stack of towels in his arms, and continued walking without the slightest change in expression. Behind the glass door, Emily watched him with growing certainty that the quiet old janitor carried far more than cleaning supplies through the halls of the SEAL Training Center. The afternoon sun cast long bands of light across the polished hallway as preparations for the commander's inspection continued with quiet urgency. Inside the gym, every detail received one final review. Equipment stood perfectly aligned. Mirrors reflected spotless rows of machines, and fresh towels had been folded with military precision. Daniel Brooks moved through the room with his familiar cleaning cart, replacing a nearly empty sanitizer dispenser before quietly checking each training station one last time. Nobody thanked him. Nobody even noticed. The operators focused instead on their uniforms, their posture, and the approaching inspection. Down the hall, Emily Foster stood outside the medical office, her phone still in her hand. At exactly 12:48 in the afternoon, it vibrated. Thomas Hale had returned the call. His voice was lower than before, carrying none of the relaxed warmth from earlier. "Emily," he said carefully, "I found something." She stepped into an empty conference room and quietly closed the door. "Who is he?" she asked. Thomas hesitated for several seconds. "His name is Daniel Brooks. If he is the man I believe he is, then his records were intentionally fragmented decades ago. I cannot access everything anymore, but I found references that should not exist." Emily listened without interrupting. "There was never an official unit name attached to the symbol," Thomas continued. "Only scattered references across archived operational files. Every document points to the same conclusion. 5 men. Highly classified assignments. Almost no surviving paperwork. Their existence was never denied because officially it was never acknowledged." Emily slowly sat down, absorbing every word. "Are they all gone?" she asked softly. Thomas answered with quiet certainty. "According to everything I can find, for names ended decades ago, only one record remains open." Emily looked through the conference room window toward the gym where Daniel was carefully straightening a row of folding chairs for visitors. "What should I do?" Thomas did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, every word carried unmistakable weight. "Do nothing that draws attention to him. But there is one person who deserves to know." "Commander Ethan Ward?" Emily asked. "Yes." Thomas's answer came instantly. His father spent years trying to identify the men behind that symbol. If Ethan sees it himself, he will understand why this matters. Emily thanked him before ending the call. She remained seated for another moment, staring silently at the blank screen of her phone. Outside the conference room, footsteps echoed through the corridor as officers prepared for the inspection schedule. Back inside the gym, Ryan Cole continued directing final adjustments with practiced confidence. "Everything looks good," he announced. "Commander Ward will be here any minute. Let us make sure there are no distractions." At that exact moment, Daniel quietly bent beside a storage cabinet to retrieve a dropped cleaning cloth. As he reached underneath the shelf, his work shirt caught briefly against the cabinet handle, pulling the sleeve halfway up his forearm. The faded tattoo appeared once again beneath the bright overhead lights. This time, Emily saw it clearly from across the room. She took a slow breath, slipped her phone into her pocket, and walked toward the entrance where the inspection party would soon arrive. Behind her, Daniel calmly adjusted his sleeve without the slightest sign of concern and resumed polishing the last section of floor. He still believed this would end like every other ordinary workday. He had no way of knowing that within minutes, the one man on the entire base capable of recognizing that forgotten mark would step through the gym doors, bringing with him a silence that would change the entire room. The gym doors opened precisely at 1 o'clock, and the steady rhythm of conversation faded almost immediately. Commander Ethan Ward entered with 2 senior officers and a civilian facilities manager, his crisp uniform carrying the quiet authority that needed no introduction. Ryan Cole stepped forward confidently, offering a sharp greeting before beginning the scheduled inspection. Ethan acknowledged him with a brief nod, his attention already moving across the spotless training floor. He noticed the perfectly aligned equipment, the polished mirrors, and the absence of even the smallest trace of dust. "Excellent work," he said calmly. Ryan allowed himself a small smile. My team takes pride in the details, Commander. As the inspection continued through the weight room, Emily Foster quietly approached from the hallway. She did not interrupt. She simply caught Ethan's eye for the briefest moment. Something in her expression caused him to slow his pace. She had worked on the base long enough that he recognized the difference between routine concern and genuine urgency. Without speaking, she glanced toward the far corner of the gym, where Daniel Brooks was quietly wiping fingerprints from the glass surrounding the recovery area. Ethan followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing unusual. Only an elderly janitor finishing his afternoon duties while everyone else focused on the inspection. Commander, Ryan continued, unaware of the silent exchange, the maintenance staff keeps this facility in excellent condition. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly but did not answer. Emily stepped closer until she stood beside him. Sir, she said softly, careful not to attract attention. Would you mind speaking with our janitor before you leave? Ethan looked at her with mild curiosity. Is there a reason? Emily chose her words carefully. I believe there is something you should see for yourself. Ethan studied her face for a moment before quietly walking away from the inspection route. Ryan frowned in confusion but followed several steps behind. Daniel heard approaching footsteps and turned politely, placing the cleaning cloth over the edge of his bucket. Good afternoon, Commander, he said with his usual calm voice. Ethan returned the greeting with equal courtesy. Good afternoon, sir. The unexpected response caused Ryan to glance sideways. The commander rarely addressed civilian employees with such deliberate respect. Ethan stood silently for a moment, studying the elderly man's face as though searching for something he could not quite identify. Finally he spoke. May I ask you a question? Daniel nodded once. Of course. Ethan's voice remained calm but noticeably quieter. Would you mind rolling back your left sleeve? The room seemed to pause without anyone understanding why. Ryan shifted his weight uncertainly. Mason Reed and Tyler Grant exchanged puzzled glances from across the gym. Even the nearby instructors slowed their conversations. Daniel looked at Ethan for several long seconds. There was no fear in his pale blue eyes, only a deep, thoughtful stillness. Then, without saying a word, he slowly folded the cuff of his gray work shirt above his elbow. The faded tattoo appeared once again beneath the bright afternoon lights. Ethan did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the weathered symbol as though the entire room had disappeared around it. Memories he had carried since childhood surfaced with startling clarity. His father sitting quietly at the kitchen table. A worn photograph. A forgotten symbol. One sentence repeated throughout his youth. If you ever meet the last man who carries that mark, stand a little straighter than everyone else. Ethan drew a slow breath but did not move. Around him the gym had become completely silent. Nobody understood why the commander suddenly looked as though he had stepped face to face with a living piece of history. Commander Ethan Ward remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the faded tattoo as though every sound inside the gym had vanished. The silence stretched for several long seconds until he slowly looked back into Daniel Brooks's weathered face. Sir, he said quietly, may I ask you one more question? Daniel answered with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the day. You may. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. Who gave you that mark? Daniel's eyes drifted briefly toward the polished floor beneath his boots. For friends, he replied softly. None of them came home with me. The words settled over the room with a weight no one could explain. Ryan Cole looked from the commander to the elderly janitor, waiting for someone to laugh or dismiss the strange conversation. No one did. Ethan slowly reached toward the cuff of his own uniform. Without breaking eye contact, he rolled back his left sleeve until the lower part of his forearm became visible. Gasps quietly spread across the room. There, faded by time but unmistakably similar, rested the same circular design surrounding a simple five-pointed star. Daniel looked at the tattoo, then back at Ethan with quiet surprise. Your father, Daniel said almost in a whisper. Ethan nodded once. Rear Admiral William Ward. A gentle smile appeared on Daniel's face for the first time all day. He was a good young officer. Ethan swallowed carefully before speaking again. He never wore that mark in public. He told me he had not earned it. He said it belonged only to the men who carried each other through impossible days. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, remembering. That sounds like William. Around them, every conversation had stopped. Mason Reed stared in disbelief. Tyler Grant slowly lowered the towel he had been carrying. Even the instructors stood motionless, unable to understand why their commander spoke to the elderly janitor with such unmistakable respect. Ethan took one deliberate step forward. Then, without hesitation, he came to full attention. His right hand rose in a slow, flawless salute. No order had been given. No ceremony had been announced. Yet the gesture carried more meaning than any formal event Ryan Cole had ever witnessed. Daniel looked almost uncomfortable. He quietly returned the salute with the same steady dignity that had defined every movement throughout the day before gently lowering his hand again. Ethan allowed his salute to fall only after several respectful seconds. His voice remained calm, but every word reached every corner of the silent gym. The man standing before you is not simply a member of our maintenance staff. He paused, choosing his next sentence with care. He belongs to a chapter of our history that many of us were never privileged to read. Ryan finally found his voice. Commander, I had no idea. Ethan turned toward him without anger. No, Chief. None of us did. He looked back at Daniel. My father spent the last years of his life hoping he might someday thank the last man who carried that symbol. Daniel smiled gently. He thanked me long ago. Ethan slowly shook his head. Then allow me to do what he would have done if he were standing here today. He extended his hand. Daniel accepted it without ceremony, their handshake quiet and unhurried. There were no speeches about glory, no dramatic declarations, only two generations connected by a promise that had survived far longer than anyone inside the gym had ever imagined possible. At that moment, every operator present understood that the quiet old man they had ignored all morning had never needed recognition to possess extraordinary honor. For several moments, no one moved. The gym that had echoed with laughter only minutes earlier now stood wrapped in a silence so complete that even the steady hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Daniel Brooks gently released Commander Ethan Ward's hand and reached for the handle of his cleaning cart as naturally as if nothing remarkable had happened. There is still one corner I have not finished, he said with a quiet smile. Ethan looked at the old man with genuine admiration. You have already done more for this place than any inspection could ever measure. Daniel simply nodded and began pushing the cart toward the far side of the room. This time, however, the path before him was different. Mason Reed instinctively stepped aside without being asked. Tyler Grant quietly picked up the bucket that Daniel had been about to carry himself and placed it beside the cart with careful respect. Ryan Cole stood motionless for a moment before walking over. The confidence that had defined his voice throughout the day had disappeared. Mr. Brooks, he said sincerely, I owe you an apology. I judged you by the job I saw instead of the life you lived. Daniel rested one hand on the cart and looked at the younger man with calm eyes. We all see only part of a person at first, he answered gently. The important thing is what we choose to see after we learn more. Ryan lowered his head briefly. I will remember that. Across the room, the operators quietly returned every towel, every bottle, and every piece of equipment to its proper place without waiting for instructions. No one wanted the elderly janitor to clean up after them anymore. Daniel noticed the change but said nothing. Gratitude did not require speeches. It revealed itself in small actions. Commander Ward slowly turned toward the assembled operators. Listen carefully, he said. Skill earns respect. Rank carries responsibility. But character is what history remembers. Never assume you know the value of the person standing in front of you simply because you recognize the uniform they wear or the job they perform. Every face remained fixed on the commander. No one looked away. Emily Foster quietly watched from the doorway, relieved that she had trusted the memory her father had left behind. As the inspection concluded, Commander Ward paused beside a small locker near the entrance where a faded plastic label read Janitor. He removed the label without ceremony and handed it to the facilities manager. "Replace this," he said. "With what, sir?" the manager asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Reserved for Daniel Brooks." Daniel looked up from his mop with mild surprise. "Commander, that is not necessary." Ethan shook his head. "Perhaps not. But respect should never be hidden where no one can see it." The following morning, long before sunrise, Daniel arrived at the gym exactly as he always had. He unlocked the door, filled his bucket, and began mopping the entrance while the building remained quiet. A few minutes later, the first group of operators entered for training. Without a word, each one paused briefly as they passed him. Some offered a simple nod. Others quietly said, "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Daniel returned every greeting with the same warm smile. Nothing else had changed. He still wore the same faded gray work shirt. He still pushed the same old cleaning cart. He still cleaned every corner before anyone else arrived. Yet the gym somehow felt different because the people inside it had changed. Sometimes the greatest stories are never written into official records, never displayed inside museums, and never announced during ceremonies. Sometimes they quietly push a mop across a polished floor, carrying memories instead of medals, proving that true honor never asks to be noticed because it has already been earned.